You've heard of Auschwitz. You've heard of Mengele. But why have you never heard of Unit 731? It looked like a standard military outpost. But behind the steel gates and smiling officers, the screams never stopped. In a remote corner of Manchuria, near the city of Harbin, the Japanese Imperial Army built a facility so secretive, so horrifying, that for decades even its existence was denied. It was not a battlefield, it was a laboratory, a place where doctors wore white coats, took meticulous notes, and dissected live human beings. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. But its true name, whispered only in classified reports and survivor testimony, was Unit 731, a cornerstone of the buried history of Japan. At the heart of this deception was a man named Shirō Ishii, a microbiologist and general who promised his nation a new kind of weapon, one that didn't use bullets or bombs, one that could destroy cities without a single shot fired. He called it progress. His victims called it hell. Today, historians and whistleblowers alike point to Unit 731 as World War II's darkest secret. A place where science and state power fused into something monstrous. Backed by high command, Ishii was given unlimited authority and an unlimited supply of prisoners to experiment on. The methods, beyond comprehension, the justification, that chilling phrase we've heard too often, for the sake of science. But when science becomes torture, can it still call itself progress? According to historian Sheldon H. Harris, whose exhaustive research remains one of the few comprehensive accounts of Unit 731, the facility tested biological weapons World War II had never seen before. Anthrax, cholera, plague. These were not just studied, they were unleashed. But perhaps the most chilling fact was not the death toll. It was the silence that followed. Tonight, we will tear open the sealed records, examine the dark logic of real-life medical experiments, and ask what happens when the pursuit of science becomes an excuse for cruelty. This is more than a war story. It is a study in how civilized institutions, hospitals, universities, laboratories can be repurposed into tools of dehumanization. It is the buried history of Japan that still casts a shadow across the ethics of medical history. And what if I told you some of its work never stopped? If stories like this make you feel something, anger, disbelief, or just the need to know, then you're not alone. This channel exists to uncover the truths buried in silence. Subscribe to join us. Like the video, share it with your friends, because some stories only survive when we choose to speak them aloud. Let us begin. Logs, not humans. They weren't prisoners. They weren't patients. In the records of Unit 731, they were simply referred to as logs. The euphemism was deliberate. To the scientists inside the Harbin complex, the people brought in for human testing in war weren't individuals with names, families, or pasts. They were units of data, flesh to be infected, frozen, dissected. They were Chinese civilians, Korean dissidents, Russian prisoners of war. Some were pregnant women, others were children. All were treated with the same cold detachment as laboratory rats. Primary sources from the time reflect this mindset with eerie consistency. Survivors who escaped other Japanese camps describe how guards joked about chopping wood when transporting victims to the operating rooms. The secret experiments Japan hid from history were not chaotic or impulsive. They were systematic, industrialized, and written down in detail. Records show test subjects being exposed to plague, cholera, and typhus, then dissected alive to observe disease progression. As documented in the work of historian Tsuneshi Keiichi, some subjects were tied down in freezing temperatures until their limbs turned black with frostbite. Doctors would then amputate fingers one by one, not for treatment, but to measure nerve reaction. In other cases, prisoners were deprived of food, water, or sleep just to chart how long the body could survive. It wasn't madness, it was protocol. But perhaps the most haunting detail comes not from what was done, but how little anyone knew. Unlike Nazi Germany's camps, which were eventually exposed in horrific clarity, the Japanese secret experiments World War II left behind almost no photographic evidence. Most facilities were burned before the end of the war. Most victims were cremated without identification, and the few witnesses who came forward were ignored. Why? Because when the Allied forces entered Japan, they didn't put Shirō Ishii on trial. They didn't search for justice. Instead, they offered him immunity in exchange for the data. What was in those notebooks that made the United States trade justice for silence? As noted by historian Daniel Barenblatt, the United States believed Ishii's findings on biological warfare were too valuable to destroy. In doing so, they not only buried the truth, they legitimized it. This wasn't just a military experiment gone wrong. It was a blueprint, purchased, stored, and perhaps even used. So the question remains, what kind of science was so valuable that the deaths of 3,000 men, women, and children became acceptable collateral? Next, we'll uncover the deal that silenced a war crime and opened a new chapter in the history of biological weapons. A deal with the devil. The war was over. Tokyo lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had burned, and while the world held its breath for the Nuremberg Trials and Japan to begin a new chapter in its history, one man quietly disappeared from view. Shirō Ishii. He was not arrested. He was not charged. He was not executed for the deaths of thousands. Instead, he boarded a train to Tokyo, carrying something far more valuable than remorse: his research. In the post-war scramble for strategic advantage, the United States made a chilling calculation. Information gathered through the horrors of government human testing might give them an edge in the coming Cold War. And so began a negotiation that would stain the legacy of both nations. The scientists of Unit 731, once hunted as war criminals, were instead asked to share their findings on plague dispersion, frostbite, and the lethal thresholds of chemical exposure. According to declassified U.S. Army records, American officials agreed to grant full immunity to Ishii and his top officers in exchange for exclusive access to the results of real-life medical experiments. These weren't vague theories. They included data on biological weapons World War II had never officially acknowledged. Plague bombs tested on Chinese villages, aerosolized anthrax trials, and fatal exposure tests conducted on infants. As documented in the research of historian John W. Powell, these findings were presented to U.S. biological warfare units as unique and invaluable. But here's what they didn't mention. The data was extracted from suffering, from organs cut out of live subjects, from children infected intentionally, from logs who screamed until their lungs collapsed. How do you catalogue knowledge that was bought with human lives? The American decision wasn't made in secret forever. Years later, whistleblowers and journalists would expose the immunity deal in detail, revealing just how much the US was willing to ignore in exchange for power. The secret experiments Japan hid from history were, in fact, known, just not by the public.
And perhaps most disturbingly, the fate of the perpetrators was not disgrace, but comfort. Many former Unit 731 scientists went on to work in Japan's post-war medical system. Some became professors. Others served in the National Health Ministry. None were ever prosecuted.
One expert on the period, historian Hal Gold, believes this immunity deal permanently altered the global ethics of post-war justice. In his words, it taught the world that if your crime is large enough and useful enough, it might never be called a crime at all. But the question still lingers in the silence that followed. If war crimes can be traded, what else can? In the next chapter, we return to Harbin, to the place where these horrors began, and where the fires of evidence didn't burn everything. Something survived. Something buried. The city that hid a lab of hell. On the surface, Harbin was a city like any other. Families gathered in tea houses. Children played in courtyards. Soldiers marched past smiling civilians. But just beyond the city's edge stood a facility surrounded by barbed wire and silence. To outsiders, it was a water purification plant. In truth, it was the epicenter of Japanese human experiments, a place where science lost its soul. Locals had suspicions. They heard trucks arriving at odd hours, the sharp crack of gunfire at dawn, the wails of the dying carried by wind. But speaking up was dangerous. The Japanese military ruled the region with brutal authority, and Harbin war crimes were cloaked beneath a veil of technical jargon and military necessity. Inside the compound, the layout resembled a hospital, sterilized, precise, and cold. There were operating rooms, dissection tables, cremation pits. There were chambers for frostbite tests and sealed rooms for bacterial infection trials. In one wing, prisoners were restrained and exposed to biological weapons World War II never formally acknowledged. Plague bacteria released in aerosol form, anthrax smeared into open wounds, or cholera injected directly into the bloodstream. Archaeological evidence suggests that when Soviet forces finally liberated the region, they found scorched earth, buildings destroyed, documents burned, equipment dismantled. But even in the ashes, bones were found. Fragments of human teeth, rusted surgical tools, shackles bolted to operating tables. Not all secrets stay buried, and some ruins whisper louder than the living. As noted by historian Yuki Tanaka, a few physical remains were preserved, even as the full scope of the crimes was denied by Japan for decades. What wasn't destroyed was buried, not only in the ground, but in memory. Survivors who spoke out were disbelieved, witnesses were threatened, and because no official reckoning ever came, the ethics of medical history were quietly rewritten, not by truth, but by omission. Unit 731 was dismantled, but its legacy seeped into the soil and into textbooks that said nothing. For years, Japanese schoolchildren were taught about the war's hardship, but not the horrors inflicted on others. The silence was not just societal, it was strategic. One former technician, decades later, confessed in an anonymous interview that he still dreamt of the dissection room, that he could still hear the patients begging not to be cut open. He described them not as enemies or traitors, but as people with eyes just like mine. In the final chapter, we return to the present. The name Unit 731 may not be taught in schools, but its influence lingers in policy, in science, and in the global failure to draw the line between research and cruelty. What happens when there is no reckoning? The experiment isn't over. Decades have passed. The buildings are gone. The fires destroyed the records. The men who oversaw Unit 731 died in hospital beds, not prison cells. But the shadow of their work never left. Today, the ethics of medical history still grapple with the same question left unanswered after the war. Can knowledge born from cruelty ever be clean? The data from real-life medical experiments conducted inside Unit 731 didn't vanish. It was archived, studied, even cited quietly by military researchers and epidemiologists across the globe. Not always explicitly, but often enough to ask, where does scientific inheritance end and complicity begin? According to bioethics scholar Jingbao Nie, the failure to formally condemn or prosecute these crimes created a dangerous precedent. It allowed government human testing to continue in the shadows, just under different flags. From Cold War-era biological research to covert CIA operations, the line between security and savagery has remained disturbingly thin. What if Unit 731 wasn't the last time the world chose silence over justice? Because shortly after the war, across the Pacific, the United States launched another program steeped in secrecy, MK Ultra, a series of experiments designed to control the human mind using drugs, hypnosis, and psychological torture. And once again, the justification was the same: national security. Once again, the test subjects were not volunteers, but civilians, prisoners, psychiatric patients, used without consent. Scholars like Susan M. Reverby have drawn chilling parallels between Japan's biological experiments and America's mind control research. Both operated under classified budgets. Both targeted the vulnerable. Both buried the truth for decades. And in both cases, those responsible faced little to no accountability. In Japan today, the name Shirō Ishii is rarely spoken. In the United States, MKUltra is dismissed as conspiracy theory, even after its existence was confirmed by Senate hearings. Monuments are scarce. Apologies, rarer still. And yet the legacy of these programs lingers in how we approach science, in what we're willing to excuse, and in who gets sacrificed for the illusion of progress. So where does this leave us? If when science becomes torture, we reward it with prestige, what kind of future are we building? This is not just the secret experiments Japan hid from history. It's a global story, a pattern, and the silence is part of it. If this shook something loose in you, we have more to uncover. The next chapter takes you into the world of MK Ultra, where memory was a weapon and even reality couldn't be trusted. Watch that video next. You won't see the world the same way again. Like, share, subscribe. Good night.